The morning air did not wake with the sun. It shattered. Automatic gunfire ripped through the village, a rhythmic, mechanical tearing that turned the dawn into a storm of lead. Alejandro was behind a stone wall before the first shell casings hit the dirt. Dust choked the street, thick and gray, raining down from the storefronts that had been whole only seconds before. He reached out and grabbed his father's arm, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white against the grit. He pulled hard, dragging him deeper into the shadow of the masonry. Above them, the sky was filled with the whine of ricochets and the heavy thud of impacts. Alejandro did not look up. He looked at the map in his pocket, then pointed toward the northern border markers, his finger trembling against the paper. The village was no longer a home. It was a target. Every second they stayed, the walls grew thinner. He held his breath, listening to the boots on the pavement outside, waiting for the silence that would tell him they could move. The danger was not a distant threat anymore. It was here, pressing against the stone, demanding a choice between flight and the end. The gunfire eventually receded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise. That night, Alejandro climbed the ladder to the roof. The corrugated metal bit into his palms, the edges sharp and unforgiving against his skin. He pulled himself up, his muscles aching, and found his friends waiting in the dim light of the stars. They sat in a tight circle, knees pulled to chests, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. Alejandro leaned forward, his voice a low, raspy whisper that barely carried over the wind. He spoke not of the war, but of a map he had memorized. He described a place where the sirens never wavered, where the stomach did not knot with the constant, gnawing pain of hunger. He talked about America. To him, it was not just a destination on a page. It was a sanctuary, a fortress of iron and law, where their lives would finally belong to them. He watched his friends listen, their faces shadowed, the hope in his words clashing with the reality of the ruined village below. They did not interrupt. They simply looked at the stars and let the dream take root, holding on to the promise of a life beyond the reach of the gunfire. 2 days passed in a haze of counting hours and listening to the distant rumble of convoys. Then, the envelope arrived. It was thick, a heavy manila packet that felt far too substantial for the thin air of the village. Alejandro watched from the doorway as the courier dropped it onto the small wooden table. His parents froze. They did not move for a long count of seconds, their eyes locked on the paper as if it might vanish if they breathed too hard. When his father finally reached out, his hand trembled so violently he had to pull it back and brace his wrist against the wood. He slid the envelope toward him, the paper rasping against the grain of the table. His mother moved closer, her fingers hovering just inches from the seal, her breath hitching in her throat. She pulled the flap open. Inside, the travel permits lay flat and crisp. They were more than paper. They were a lifeline. Alejandro watched his parents' faces cycle through shock, disbelief, and finally, a fragile, terrifying hope. They held the permits like they were made of glass, their palms steadying as the reality of their escape solidified. The waiting was over. The path was set. The border crossing was not a gate, but a sterile, echoing terminal that smelled of industrial cleaner and cold metal. Alejandro gripped his mother's hand so tightly his own knuckles turned bloodless and his fingers began to ache. Every surface around them was smooth, white, and unforgiving. He watched the people walking past, their faces flat, their movements hurried and detached. In the center of the terminal, a vending machine hummed, displaying packages of strange, processed foods in neon wrappers. He stared at the rows of artificial colors, his stomach churning at the unfamiliar sense of preservatives and synthetic sugar. There was no warmth here, only the sharp, persistent buzz of fluorescent lights that made his eyes sting. He looked at his father, who stood rigid, staring at a blank wall, his jaw set against the sudden, crushing weight of their displacement. The air here felt thin, recycled, and hollow. Alejandro felt the silence of the room press against his eardrums, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of his home. They were no longer in the village, and they were not yet anywhere else. They were suspended in a clinical void, waiting for a future that offered no comfort. The promise of sanctuary dissolved under the relentless, white-hot glare of the sun. Alejandro spent his adolescence bent double in the sugar beet fields, where the ground was hard as stone and the rows stretched into a blurring horizon. By midday, the heat was a physical weight pressing against his spine. His skin began to blister, the surface bubbling and breaking under the constant assault of the light. He worked with a rhythm born of necessity, his movements mechanical, his mind focused entirely on the reach and pull of the harvest. Then came the swarms. Mosquitoes rose from the damp earth in thick, buzzing clouds, settling on his neck and forearms. Each bite left a raised, angry red welt that throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He did not stop to swat them. He kept his hands moving, fingers working the dirt, ignoring the sting that crawled across his skin. His muscles burned with a dull, constant ache, and his throat grew parched, coated in the fine, dry dust of the fields. Every breath tasted of dirt and sweat. The work was a relentless cycle of physical erosion, stripping away the remnants of his former life until all that remained was the raw, aching necessity of labor. The heavy wooden crates bit into his shoulders, the edges digging deep into his skin with every step toward the barn. He moved with his head down, focused on the steady placement of his boots in the dirt. Then, the rhythmic sound of his own breathing was broken by laughter. 3 boys from the town stood on the porch, watching him with eyes that saw only a target. They did not speak, but their presence was a wall that blocked his path. One of them picked up a jagged stone and tossed it, watching it bounce off the dry earth just inches from Alejandro's feet. The dust puffed up, coating his boots. Alejandro stopped. His hands tightened around the crate, the wood groaning under the pressure of his grip. He felt the heat of his own blood rising, a wild, sharp urge to drop the load and charge the porch. His jaw locked so tightly his teeth ached. He looked at the ground, watched the dirt settle, and forced himself to exhale. He did not look up. He did not say a word. He shifted the weight of the crates, stepped around the stone, and kept walking. The laughter continued behind him, but he reached the barn, dropped the load, and turned back toward the field, his pulse hammering a rhythm of defiance against the silence of his own restraint. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the labor did not end. It merely shifted. Alejandro sat at the small, wobbly table in the back of the house, a single bulb flickering overhead. His fingers, still stained with the dark silt of the beet fields, moved across the pages of his textbooks with surgical precision. He did not read. He devoured. He parsed complex equations and memorized historical timelines until the words blurred, then shook his head and started the paragraph again. His eyes burned from the long hours, but he kept his focus locked on the ink. When he stumbled over a concept, he did not walk away. He pulled out his notebook and calculated the problem until the answer aligned perfectly. He tracked his progress in the margins, marking each completed chapter as a step away from the life he was forced to lead. By the end of the term, his transcript was a clean, flawless record of success. He stared at the final grades, his breath steadying for the first time in years. These perfect marks were his silent argument against the world. He gathered the documents, placed them into an envelope, and sealed it with a firm press of his hand. He was no longer just a worker in the dirt. He was a candidate for the future. The mailbox clattered, a sound that usually signaled nothing. Alejandro walked to the end of the gravel drive, his hands steady, until he touched the thin, brittle paper of the envelopes. 3 of them, all from prestigious institutions. He carried them back to the table, the same table where he had spent months perfecting his knowledge. He tore the first one open. The paper was stiff, the print sharp and clinical. He read the first sentence, then the second. No offer of admission. The letter cited a lack of legacy status and a deficit of financial pedigree as high as the primary reasons for the denial. He set it down, and Irgun the second, then the third. The words were identical mirrors of the first. He looked at his transcript, the perfect marks that had cost him his youth, and compared them to the rejection notices. The logic he had built his entire future upon disintegrated in the quiet of the room. He picked up the letters, folded them along the existing creases, and dropped them into the metal trash bin. The sound of them hitting the bottom was hollow. He stood in the kitchen, his gaze fixed on the wall, and watched the last of the daylight fade from the window. The meritocracy he had studied for was a locked door, and he did not have the key. Alejandro did not linger in the house. He shoved the bin of rejection letters into the furnace, watching the paper curl into black ash, and walked out the door. The gravel crunched under his boots, a familiar sound, but his pace was different today. He moved past the sugar beet fields, not stopping to look at the rows that had defined his adolescence. He reached the town center and stopped before a storefront with a small, unadorned sign. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. A man sat behind a desk, his eyes scanning Alejandro with practiced indifference. Alejandro did not need to explain his grades or his pedigree here. He reached for the paperwork, his hand moving with a precision that had nothing to do with textbooks. He scanned the lines, checking the boxes that required his consent, and picked up the pen. The metal felt cold against his skin. He signed his name once, then twice, pressing down hard enough to leave an indentation on the desk beneath the paper. The ink was dark and permanent. He handed the document back, his expression blank, his heartbeat steady. The transition was complete. He had traded his dreams of academia for the weight of a rifle, and for the first time since leaving home, he felt the path ahead was clear. The transition to the barracks was a sensory shift from the isolation of the fields to the synchronized rhythm of the squad. Here, the labels he had carried through his youth: immigrant, outsider, laborer, dissolved under the demands of the training. He stood in the mess hall, holding a dented metal till identical to the one held by the man beside him. There was no hierarchy of pedigree, only the shared exhaustion of the morning run and the weight of the packs they hauled across the training grounds. He watched the others. They did not ask about his legacy status or his financial history. They asked if he could hold his pace when the mud reached his knees and the sun hit its peak. He found a strange clarity in the uniformity. In the dark hours of the night, when they cleaned their gear in the flickering light of the barracks, he realized he was no longer an observer of American life. He was a participant. The brotherhood was built not on social standing, but on the simple, brutal reality of relying on the person to his left and his right. For the first time, he belonged to a group that measured him only by his resolve. The heavy transport vehicle shuddered and slowed, the engine drone dropping to a low, vibrating hum that rattled the teeth of every man inside. Alejandro sat in the cramped space, his back pressed against the vibrating bulkhead, his fingers gripping the cold straps of his pack. The air inside was thick with the smell of diesel and human sweat. A sudden, jarring stop threw his body forward against the restraint. Then, the sound of hydraulic locks disengaging echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The rear ramp began to descend, inch by agonizing inch. A searing, white-hot light flooded the interior, blinding everyone for a heartbeat. Alejandro did not wait for the order. He stood, the weight of his gear dragging at his spine, and moved toward the opening. The desert heat hit him like a physical blow, dry and suffocating. He saw the horizon, a shimmering line of dust and heat haze. He reached the edge of the ramp, his boots finding purchase on the metal tread. He took a breath, locked his jaw, and stepped off the vehicle, his feet slamming into the sand first. He was out. The invasion had begun, and he moved forward without looking back at the machine that had brought him to the edge of the world. The city of Fallujah was a labyrinth of shattered concrete and rising dust. Alejandro moved at a sprint, his boots crunching over pulverized brick. Every corner held a potential threat, the air thick with the metallic tang of spent casings and the dry, choking grit of pulverized masonry. A sudden burst of automatic fire tore through the wall beside his head, showering him in plaster dust. He dived behind a rusted vehicle, the metal groaning under the impact of incoming rounds. He pressed his back to the frame, his heart hammering against his ribs, his rifle burning against his palms from continuous use. The smoke was a living wall, gray and suffocating, swallowing the sun until the streets were plunged into a dim, fractured twilight. He crawled forward, ignoring the sting of gravel embedded in his skin. He reached the end of the alley, checked the sector, and rose to fire. The recoil kicked into his shoulder, steady and rhythmic. He did not think. He reacted. With every trigger pull, the chaos of the desert narrowed down to a single, cold focus. He pushed through the burning haze, the heat of the conflict searing into his memory, carving a place in his soul that would never again be quiet. The sky turned a bruised purple as the mortar barrage began. It was not a battle of men anymore. It was a rhythmic, systematic tearing of the earth. Alejandro saw his squad leader signal to break right, but the ground erupted before they could move. Dirt, shrapnel, and the roar of displaced air slammed into his chest. He hit the sand hard, burying his face in the grit to keep his lungs clear of the choking dust. Beside him, the equipment was shredded, the metal twisting into grotesque shapes in the heat. He reached out, his hand gripping the arm of the man next to him, feeling the frantic pulse through the fabric. They were just targets in a vast, uncaring landscape. When the shelling paused, the silence that followed was sharper than the noise. Alejandro rose on shaky knees, his ears ringing with a high-pitched, endless whine. He looked across the cratered dunes at the faces of his unit. They were covered in the same gray dust, their eyes hollowed out by the realization of their own fragility. He picked up his rifle, the weight of it now feeling different, heavier, as if it were tethered to the ghosts of the day. He stood in the center of the ruin, breathing in the smell of scorched earth, knowing that the man who had stepped off the transport was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly how thin the line between existence and oblivion truly was. The plane touched down, but Alejandro did not leave the war behind. He stepped onto the tarmac, his eyes reflexively sweeping the perimeter, checking shadows for movement. The air in his hometown felt too thin, lacking the heavy scent of diesel and scorched earth he had grown accustomed to. He walked through the terminal, his gait stiff, legs braced as if expecting the ground to shift underfoot. When he reached his old front door, he paused, his hand hovering over the wood for a long moment before he turned the key. Inside, the house was silent, frozen in the same arrangement he had left behind years ago. He set his bags down, but the weight remained on his shoulders, a phantom pack he could not unstrap. He sat on the edge of the sofa, his back perfectly straight, jaw clamped tight enough to ache. Every tick of the wall clock sounded like a trigger reset. He stared at the blank wall, his hands resting flat on his knees, fingers twitching in rhythm with a phantom cadence. He was home, yet every muscle in his body remained coiled, waiting for an order that would never come. His posture now a physical monument to the distance between the man who left and the veteran who returned. Alejandro walked toward the center of town, his stride measured and deliberate. The morning sun caught the metal on his chest, but the light seemed to slide off him without recognition. He passed the corner where the local boys gathered, the same group that had once tossed stones at his feet. They did not move. They did not speak. One of them leaned back against the brick wall, eyes tracking Alejandro with a slow, deliberate sneer that ignored the ribbons and the service stripes completely. He felt the weight of their gaze not as a greeting, but as a dismissal. He stopped at the storefront, waiting for a nod or a word. But the group turned their heads, focusing their laughter on a point just behind his shoulder. To them, he was a ghost, a silhouette of a man who had never left, or worse, one who did not belong. He kept his hands at his sides, fingers curling into tight, rhythmic fists. He felt the heat rise in his neck, yet he did not break his pace. He walked past them, the silence between them thicker than any wall he had ever faced in the desert. They looked right through him, their indifference sharpening the reality of his isolation. The front door clicked shut, locking the rejection of the town outside. Alejandro moved through the hallway, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood, and settled into the living room. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky bled into a bruised, deep violet. He did not reach for the light switch. Instead, he sat on the sofa as the shadows pooled in the corners of the room, growing long and jagged against the wallpaper. The darkness pressed against the glass of the window, a solid, weightless barrier that cut him off from the street. He turned his head toward the end table, where a single frame caught the dying light. It was a photograph of his unit, captured mid-laugh in the dust of a staging area. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and traced the faces of the men in the frame. The room grew colder as the evening deepened. He watched the light leave the room entirely, leaving him in a gray, quiet space where only the faces in the photo remained distinct. He did not look away. He kept his gaze locked on the image, his breathing shallow as the house groaned under the settling of the floorboards. The isolation was no longer a choice. It was the only thing left in the room. He shifted his weight on the sofa, the leather creaking in the absolute silence of the house. On the coffee table, the service pistol lay nestled against a stack of discarded mail. It was a heavy, matte black shape in the gloom, absorbing the faint moonlight that managed to bleed through the curtains. Alejandro leaned forward until his face was inches from the table. He could smell the faint, metallic tang of gun oil, a scent that cut through the stale air of the living room. His right hand drifted from his knee, fingers twitching, and extended toward the weapon. He stopped an inch above the grip. He could feel the cold radiating from the steel, a dull ache that seeped into his palm. His heartbeat thudded against his ribs, a rhythmic, heavy sound that seemed to fill the entire room. He held his hand there, suspended in the dark, watching the way his own skin looked pale and alien against the dark finish of the firearm. Every muscle in his arm was rigid, locked in a tremor he could not suppress. He did not grip it. He did not pull it away. He simply hovered, balanced on the razor edge of a final, irreversible choice. The silence in the room finally snapped. Alejandro pulled his hand back, his fingers curling into a tight, shaking fist against his chest. A sharp, ragged breath tore through his throat, followed by a sound he had spent years suffocating. It started as a low, guttural vibration in his lungs. Then, the first sob broke free. He doubled over, his forehead pressing hard into his palms, his shoulders heaving with the force of the release. The dam had failed. He could not stop the tremors that racked his frame, nor the tears that tracked hot paths through the stubble on his cheeks. He gasped for air, his throat raw, and began to whisper. He spoke the name of the sergeant from the Fallujah crossing. He whispered the name of the private who fell in the desert heat. One by one, he recited the list, his voice cracking, stumbling over syllables he had been trying to forget. Each name was a physical blow. He rocked back and forth on the sofa, the floorboards groaning in sympathy, his entire existence distilled down to the grief he had carried across oceans. He wept until his ribs ached and his vision blurred, the names filling the empty room like ghosts. The weeping faded into shallow, ragged gasps that gradually synced with the rhythm of the house. Alejandro's head dropped, his chin hitting his collarbone. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the salt of his tears and the lingering scent of stale coffee. He reached out blindly, his hand fumbling across the coffee table until it struck the neck of a half-empty bottle. He did not need much. He tipped it back, the liquid burning a familiar, numbing path down his throat. A dull flame meant to extinguish the fire in his brain. The bottle clattered against the wood, rolling until it hit the leg of the table. His eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. He slumped sideways, his shoulders sliding against the rough fabric of the sofa cushions. The tremors in his limbs slowed, then stopped. His breathing deepened, becoming heavy and mechanical. The faces of the fallen, the smoke of the desert, the weight of the metals, all of it dissolved into a gray, featureless void. The room went silent again, but this time, the silence held no threat. He drifted into a hollow, dark space where no memories could follow, the alcohol pulling him down into a profound, suffocating stillness. A blade of harsh white sunlight cut across the living room, striking Alejandro directly in the eyes. He blinked, the brightness stinging like an infection. His muscles protested, stiff and cold from the night spent slumped on the sofa. He sat up, the movement slow, deliberate, each joint popping in the quiet air. On the coffee table, the metal of the service pistol caught the morning light, a dull, heavy gray. Alejandro stared at it for a long beat. The weight of the steel felt like a promise he was not yet ready to keep. He took a sharp, steadying breath, pushed himself upright, and walked past the table, leaving the weapon behind. He reached the kitchen, the linoleum floor cold under his bare feet. He filled a glass with water, the tap stuttering as it ran, and swallowed the liquid in one long mechanical draught. Outside, the world was already moving, indifferent to the ghosts he carried. He leaned his hands against the counter, knuckles tight, and stared out at the street. The war did not end with his return, and it did not end with the sunrise. He straightened his posture, checked his reflection in the dark glass of the oven, and began the day. The silence was suffocating, but he moved through it, one step at a time.